We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Welcome to the latest Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined this week by two Planet Holyrood veterans, John Ferguson, the editor of the Sunday Mail, and Ben Borland, the editor of the Scottish Daily Express. So, as we're recording just now, I think that the First Minister's summit on political extremism, the rise of the far right, protecting Scotland's democracy, whatever you want to call it, is winding down. I think that his press conference on the summit will be starting. It's hard to know where to start with this one, Ben. I mean, I think that the principle of it is pretty sound. The rise of reform is worrying. It's good to talk about these things. But my sense of it is that rather than talking about the rise of reform and how bad it is, it might be better to talk about why reform are surging in the polls and the reasons behind it, which is basically the failure of mainstream parties and governments to deliver on people's priorities. Hence, parties like Reform start to do well in the polls.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think Reform puts out a very reasonable statement ahead of the summit, where they said pretty much that the reason why people are looking for an alternative is because the mainstream parties haven't really performed very well. People see the schools aren't satisfactory. That there's violence in the classrooms. There's the curriculum doesn't seem to be delivering the results people want. People see potholes. There's all manner of problems that lead to the electorate, the voters feeling like we're not getting a voice, we're not getting a kick of the ball. We've tried voting for various different parties and nothing seems to change. So here's an alternative. And I just find it ridiculous and insulting that John Swinney says this is the far right. You know, we've been along this road before. And I remember you made the point that in the Express, we used to describe routinely Jeremy Corbyn as the far left. And today we still describe the Scottish Greens as, far left politicians. But far right's got a different connotation. Far right has got a whole new, and John Swinney and others who are at this summit are trying to tar all the people who are going to vote Reform, no matter what this summit says, as far right. And it's ridiculous. It's not far right to want to regain control of your own lives and your own communities.
But blaming immigrants for pretty much everything is a trope of the far right.
Well, that's a trope of the far right. It's not necessarily a trope of Reform. I mean,
they are obsessed with immigration. Everything seems to come back to controlling borders.
I think,
regardless of whether it's the economy or public services, it always comes back to people who are coming from foreign countries.
I mean, that is a large part of, particularly in England, that is a large part of some of the social pressures that councils and communities are under. I don't think Reform UK Scotland, which is it's still in its early days, but it is a distinct party. You don't see a lot of talk about migrants from them.
I mean, there was the Glasgow Council by-election recently, and I did a story on this. They were trying to make a suggestion that a former care home was going to be turned into an asylum seeker hotel, and it turned out not to be true. I just think it was very sort of telling that they would reach for that sort of narrative, which was bogus.
That may be bogus. I don't know much about that story. I do remember it in the paper. Glasgow Council, SNP-run Glasgow Council, has said that they're under huge pressure because of the number of asylum seekers and refugees who are coming to the city. Alan Casey, the SNP convener for housing, the guy who's also in charge of the safe drugs consumption room. Nobody would say he's far right, and yet he's called for a pause on asylum seekers coming to the city.
I think that's probably because councils in other parts of Scotland haven't pulled their weight on this. Glasgow really has blazed a trail on that policy to the extent that I don't think that quite the only council, I might be wrong on that, but Glasgow Council, to its credit, has housed asylum seekers where other local authorities haven't. I think that's what the issue is, rather than the principle of taking asylum seekers and then using it as
Alan Casey hasn't said we want Edinburgh and Dundee and Stirling to step up. He said we want the UK government to stop sending us asylum seekers. No one, I mean, was that discussed at the far right summit? Perhaps Alan Casey should have been blasted as some kind of far right anti-migrant rabble rouser.
Yeah, but the solution to society's problems is not going to come with fewer asylum seekers. I mean, I totally understand that mainstream parties and governments have let people down. They've not delivered on their priorities. We've had austerity. We're told lies about Brexit. There was all sorts of problems with COVID, now the cost of living crisis. So I get the disenchantment, but it's the solutions that right-wing parties like Reform come up with just don't. They're insubstantial. You know, they come up with these ridiculously populist, so-called easy solutions to complex problems that once you look at it, it's just, you know, we're not gonna make society better by, you know, taking 5,000 fewer asylum seekers. Our problems are much more deep rooted in that.
If I make a couple of points, sorry, then John, totally hogging the mic here in this far right section for some reason. But the first point is, let's not forget that this whole summit is a political wheeze drawn up by the SNP strategists to try and demonize reform, but at the same time get Anna Sauer to fall into a trap where if he snubs the summit, he's in favour of the far right. If he goes along, which he has done, he's faithfully trotted along to this ridiculous talking shop. And he's therefore, I mean, it's job done. He's upset Nigel Farage, who said at the weekend, no chance, Reform aren't backing Anna Sauer for First Minister. No deals with Labour. So the summit's already done its job. It's forced Labour into a hard position between a rock and a hard place, and Sauer's fallen for it.
So before I let John come in on this private disagreement, you know, I take your point. You're right that there's a great deal of cynicism about this summit and the motivations behind it, and it probably is a trap for Anna Sauer. But there's a world of difference between recognising those things and then trying to sort of downplay reform. Like there's some sort of mainstream party, you know, they do appeal to the worst instincts of the British people. That is there for all to see. And it would be a disaster if they were represented at Holyrood. If people vote for them, that's fine. But, you know, we shouldn't pull our punches on this mob. You know, they do pander to the lowest common denominator. They do blame immigrants and other minorities for things that got nothing
pandering
to do with it.
It's the same side of it's the opposite side of the same coin that the SNP do, pandering to the worst instincts of Scots, in that kind of blame England for everything, blame Westminster, blame the Tories. It's two sides of the same populist coin.
The SNP are pro-immigration and pro-EU. You would never get that from Farage and Reform.
But it's still blaming someone else for your problems.
Well, I mean, all political parties will blame someone, but it's whether you blame a minority for the ills of society. I mean, there are many problems with the SNP, many criticisms you can make of them, but I'm not sure that as a party they blame the weak and the vulnerable in society for the problems that we face. That's what Reform do. Reform always go back to this issue with immigration and asylum seekers like it's their fault. If only we had less immigration, fewer asylum seekers, society would be magically much better. And I just think it's simplistic nonsense.
So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a big difference between blaming migrants, some of the most vulnerable people in society, for all of the ills that we face at the moment, and blaming the Prime Minister and the current UK government. That's clearly a reasonable person to blame, whereas migrants aren't. Was the summit a good idea? I don't think so. It kind of feels like it's playing into Reform's hands. One of their main narratives that they push is this idea that there's a cosy political consensus among these mainstream parties, and that no matter who you vote for, you'll get the same thing. And this just kind of compounds that that idea, doesn't it? You've got all of the main parties coming together to oppose essentially reform. Now, our reform far right, I think the best description is probably that they are people of a far right mindset who are clever enough not to entirely show that in public. But I think, whenever there's stories about what the people who are standing for reform actually think in private, they tend to be views that are quite aligned with what you would describe as the far right. But then you get to the question, well, is it worth attacking them on that basis? I don't think that it is. I think that there's plenty of other ways to attack reform. I mean, it's as if people have forgotten, because they've changed their name, that this is essentially the party that brought you Brexit, which has been an absolute disaster economically for the UK by any measure at all. This is the party that absolutely loved Trump, despite the fact he's in the process of crashing the global economy. He's deporting people illegally. He's sacked hundreds of thousands of government workers. So there's plenty of examples of why reform are a bad idea. Why they are a party that offer simple solutions to very difficult problems, and those simple solutions we're seeing in America at the moment backfiring with spectacular results. So what I would do is, I don't think we really need a far right summit. I think we should just focus on really pointing out why this isn't a party that have got the solutions to any of the problems that we face at the moment.
I'll just make a couple of points. And first, I just want to say, I'm not a reform supporter. I'm not a reform spokesman.
We know you vote Lib Dem. I know, just to point that out again.
As I've said before, I vote Lib Dem. I vote Lib Dem to keep the SNP out in my local constituency. The first thing I'd say about reform is that the pro-UK majority in Scotland is already split between three parties. We don't need it split between a fourth. That's why the SNP are talking up reform, because they know it splits the unionist vote. And they know that that's going to hurt Labour. It's going to hurt the Tories.
Are the SNP talking up reform?
I think they're talking up reform by this very summit. This summit doesn't need to happen.
I mean, it would be a pretty incredible, cynical plot of, in actual fact, John Swinney's holding this summit in order to try to win reform more votes.
What else is he trying to do? Why else is he doing it? He's doing it, A, to catch Sauer in a trap, and B, to keep reform on the agenda, because he knows that reform hurt the Tories, they hurt Labour. Because the unfortunate fact is that the majority of the Scottish population have never had their constitutional view represented at Holyrood for nigh on 20 years. There's a majority of people who want to stay in the UK, who want this whole independence question finished and just never discussed again.
Well, I think,
and yet that never happens. The other point,
I thought you were just saying that the reform voters were the same people as SNP voters, and that actually the SNP
no, the other sides of the same coin. The tactics are the same, other side of the same coin. What the other thing I would say is, we're talking about the far right, keep the far right out. How about just giving the right a try? We've had, 25 years?
We had like 15 years of the Tories.
I'm on about in Scotland. Probably the most successful Scottish government was the first Alex Salmond administration, which was probably, let's say, a small c Conservative, tartan Tories. And it was by far the most successful. Give the actual Tories a go.
So give the keys to Butte House to a
Russell
party,
Findlay,
who's
not
actually
at this summit.
Wrecked the economy across the UK.
It's a different party. That's the UK Conservative. We're talking about the Scottish
They're one and
Conservative.
the same. They're one. There's no difference. And of course, I pointed this out many times. Russell Findlay supported Liz Truss. Let's give him the keys to Butte House so he could wreck Scotland in the way that his mentor wrecked the UK. That sounds like an absolutely
just because
disastrous idea.
people in the Tories were given two choices. He backed one side. I don't think he was out there with a placard going Truss for leader.
I'm no fan of Sunak, but what does it say about a guy's judgment that he looks at Truss, he looks at Sunak and goes for Truss? Judgment call.
Well, in
his judgment's
hindsight,
a disaster. Putting him in charge of Boot House. Come off it.
2020 hindsight, great. Let's apply all that our political decisions.
Russell Finlay would be lucky to get 5th place after the next Holyrood election. He's going to be behind Labour. He's going to be behind Reform. He might be behind the Lib Dems. More chance of me being First Minister than him.
Okay, well, I mean, so we'd be back to having, a Labour First Minister.
You might need to switch your vote.
I might do. I'd take another Labour First Minister. I really would.
Look, I think the question is, how should Labour respond to this? I mean, clearly Anas Sarwar's not massively enthusiastic about attending, but he probably feels like he has to. But, for me, the most successful UK government the last 100 years was Attlee's government, made huge advances to people's living standards, the NHS, the welfare state. The Blair government also made people better off. I think the solution is obvious. Starmer needs bold, transformative policies that actually put more money into people's pockets. That would stem and halt the rise of reform more than any daft summit will. And they need to get on with the bread and butter of making services better, growing the economy and making people, genuinely feel like they're better off. That's the solution. Not a talking shop.
I think the problem that Keir Starmer's got is that those bold solutions cost a lot of money. That you're starting to talk about things like renationalising industries and really expanding the welfare state, really tackling child poverty. These things cost a lot of money, and the problem for UK government and the Scottish government is that they just don't have that
well,
money.
What
you could do is look at some really radical tax policies. For example, the wealth tax. I think these are the kind of things that perhaps could quell the rise of reform. But Labour did have a leader that was into all of that stuff in Jeremy Corbyn previously, but he
Well, I think he's part of the reason for the rise of reform. I mean, not only were the Tories useless in office, but people looked at Labour during the Corbyn years and thought they're even more useless. So I'm not keen on going back to the Corbyn era, but, just to go back to Attlee and to Blair, you can't have expansionist policies that make people better off with the sort of fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves sticks to. And, we keep hearing rightly that the world has changed over the last month, given the tariffs. Surely it's time for the fiscal rules to change. I know you're not keen on that, Ben. You don't particularly want a change in borrowing, but
I think I've said this before. I think since Trump got in, Labour are revitalised. They look a lot more like a serious government these days. I think the Scunthorpe British Steel decision, I think that will help in the council elections in the north of England. I think on every doorstep across the north of England, Labour will be saying, we're the guys who saved British Steel. I think that's their biggest card to play against reform.
So look, segue into
away from Swinney's ridiculous talking shop.
We'll segue into the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election, which is related to all the things that we're talking about, because we've now got candidates, I was going to say for the three main parties. I'm actually putting Reform as the third main party in this by-election. Labour, you've got, God, I've forgotten his name, David Russell. You've also got Katie Loudon from the SNP, and I think Reform have also selected their candidate, a local councillor, this afternoon. So, we've spoken about this on the podcast before. I think that, speaking to other journalists, speaking to pollsters, there's an assumption that the SNP might be favourites in the sense that there's a desire to punish Labour for the mistakes of the first 8-9 months of their government, and also the rise of Reform will probably harm Labour. Is that how you see it? That, obviously there's an anti-SNP vote in the constituency, but the anger might be more directed towards London and Edinburgh at this particular moment in time?
Yeah, it feels like it's going to be very close. It's a dangerous one for Labour, isn't it? Because it's clearly close enough that they need to really go for this. It's going to be a high-profile battle, and if they lose it, it's going to be a real sore one. But they need to try to win it. I've already noticed stories in the Daily Record from you, Paul, panning the Conservative candidate as a guy who's been trying to hypnotise people into voting for the Tories.
Look into my eyes and vote Conservative. No, I don't think I will, actually.
The Labour candidate, someone who used to be a business associate of
Barry
Ferguson. So I guess that won't actually damage his chances in half the electorate's eyes. So it's going to be a really interesting contest. I suspect there will be more stories to come out about all of the candidates, and the stakes are really high because it's going to be looked upon as a sort of pointer to what's going to happen next year at the Holyrood election.
Do you think Labour could sneak a win?
I think they could. I think David Russell's a good candidate, Lord Lieutenant of Lanarkshire. Good royal appointment there. I think, like you're saying, Lark Hall, his Rangers connection's going to do him no harm. I think there's obviously the tragic circumstances in which the by-election came about. I think will be a factor. I think there'll be some residual sympathy, among voters. I think the SNP, no one's going to play on that. I just think that will be a factor. The SNP, Katie Loudon's, it's her third go. I think the SNP will win it, and I don't think Labour will read too much into it. I think it's
I think the political parties as well should caution against sort of outdated stereotypes of parts of that constituency, like Lark Hall. I mean, from what I gather, Lark Hall's grown in size, more diverse than it was, and you have to remember that particular constituency has been represented by a nationalist, a Scottish nationalist, for many years. So a certain type of campaign, narrowly focused, I don't think is going to cut it for the Labour Party. I think they have to look at how they won in Rutherglen, which is winning over sort of lower middle class strivers who were once in the SNP camp. That is the way to victory for them in this by-election and next year's Holyrood election. I think any sort of just narrowly focused campaign on so-called unionist voters is not going to be successful.
I think the fact that we're actually sat here talking about the campaign and saying, can Labour win it? Could Labour squeak a victory? Shows that they have recovered at UK level. If this had happened last December in the midst of the winter fuel cuts and the WASPy women cuts and all the rest of it, there would have been no chance. We were talking about the SNP romping to another term in office. Labour have staged something of a recovery, and
it's going to be a test of whether that's true or not.
Well, how far? Even a narrow defeat would be better than they would have got, say, in November or December last year.
I think a defeat is a defeat. Labour really need to be winning this one.
This is a former heartland, isn't it? It's somewhere that they need to be able to show things have changed. You're back.
Well, it would be good to see. I mean, they've won it at Westminster, whereas actually the MP doesn't have a great deal of influence over people's daily lives, whereas the MSP does. The policies that rule justice, schools, council funding, all the rest of the day-to-day devolved issues will be decided by the MSP, not the MP.
I think that's potentially going to be one of the very interesting things that we'll see from the result here, is just how big the divide is now between the way people view a Holyrood election and a Westminster one. A big one for the SNP would suggest that there is a completely different set of values attached to.
It would suggest that there's a lot of people in Scotland who will vote SNP at Holyrood and Labour at Westminster.
Yeah.
Final subject. If you thought that the Supreme Court decision last week on the definition of a woman was the final say in the matter, then you'll be disappointed. This momentous decision continues to sort of go on, and there were further ripples this week. Now, before we talk about it, I interviewed the First Minister, John Swinney, in Butte House last week, asked him for his reaction to the Supreme Court decision. I think we can get a clip of that just now.
There's a big Supreme Court judgment this morning on the legal definition of a woman. The Scottish Government is on the losing side of that argument, that case. What's your response to the decision?
The first thing is that I accept the outcome of the Supreme Court case. I believe in the rule of law, so the right and the immediate thing to do is to accept without question the judgment of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has brought clarity to two pieces of legislation that the Scottish Government was navigating its way through. The Gender Recognition Act, which was passed in 2004 by the UK Parliament, and the Equality Act 2010, again passed by the UK Parliament. And it's brought absolute clarity on that question. So we need to reflect on that ruling. We need to engage constructively with all voices in Scotland about the ruling. And I think it's really important for me at the outset to say that making sure that I need a government that protects the rights of everybody is fundamental to my response to the judgment of the Supreme Court.
Do you think that on behalf of the Scottish Government you owe women an apology?
We've acted in good faith on this question. We've tried to navigate our way through two pieces of legislation, and during which, of course, our position has been supported twice by courts in Scotland in this particular case. So the debate has been around very uncertain areas of definition, and the Supreme Court has concluded on that, and that's an end to the matter. And I don't question it, I accept it. But what we've been trying to do is to navigate our way through what's been legislation that's been difficult to work our way through, and the Supreme Court has given us clarity.
So as we heard there from John Swinney, he fully accepted the judgment of the Supreme Court.
Big of him.
There was a parliamentary statement by his cabinet secretary yesterday. She reiterated that message of accepting the judgment. We're all waiting for new guidance to be issued for the public sector on things like single-sex spaces. But it did seem to me that the Scottish Government yesterday was hiding behind this UK-wide equalities watchdog, hoping that they were going to be issuing their guidance soon, which they might then piggyback onto. Whatever way you look at it, this has not been a good week for the Scottish Government. They went out on a limb on this issue, and ultimately they crashed and burned in the Supreme Court, and it's left a lot of confusion.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult really to imagine how the Supreme Court could have come to another judgment on this. I know that there had been previous rulings in Scotland, but really I think the judgment they've issued is pretty clear that you can't really, if you're to say that the definition of a woman can somehow be, isn't just to do with the biological sex of the person, then you can't really have meaningful laws around that. So it's difficult to see how they could come to a different conclusion. It does seem that that's the conclusion most of the public have come to. You've now got the highest court in the land compounding that, and I think really the best course of action now for the SNP would be to accept they got this one wrong and to fall into line, both in spirit and in law, behind the Supreme Court's judgment. I do think there is a shame that this has become so politicised, and you should remember that what you're talking about here are a minority of often really quite vulnerable people who are going to feel further ostracised as a result of this. We've now got this situation with Maggie Chapman, the Green MSP, who's said that this court ruling is hateful, and she's had Roddy Dunlop now write to Parliament to ask her to apologise and potentially to try to seek her removal from Holyrood Committee. So the whole thing,
the Equalities Committee.
Yeah, yes. So the whole thing is going to run, and I think the best thing that John Swinney could do is to try to just draw a line under it as soon as possible.
I agree. I think, I mean, as you said, Paul, I think I don't have a problem with the Scottish Government waiting for the Equalities Commission. I think that's, I'd like to see that more often, that we take a UK-wide approach to these matters. That's fine by me. If they want to wait and take whatever the UK-wide interpretation of these laws is, then great. The more UK policy making, the better, as far as I'm concerned. The other thing to point out is that, and just to sort of go back to reform, obviously we're talking about reform or the far right, such terrible people. 2 and a bit years ago, anyone who didn't agree with trans rights and the fact, you know, that the idea that men can become women was a bigot, a transphobe. Far right, I think, was often used. It was a view of the far right that men couldn't become women. And now, as you say, it's the view of the vast majority of the UK. And I think it just shows how these causes, when the bandwagon's rolling, people go, oh, that's terrible, that's terrible. But actually, in the cold light of day, I think we'll come to a similar position in a few years where people go, well, actually, Reform aren't that bad. They're just they're just another party. So it is funny how it sort of goes around. What goes around comes around. But the one person we haven't heard from in all of this is Nicola Sturgeon. I mean, what she was the band leader. She was the spearhead, the figurehead for this whole movement. She was the one who said that people who didn't agree with her were transphobes and bigots and probably racist to boot.
She has been unusually quiet.
She's been very quiet. Yeah,
is it really true? I know that's this is kind of being accepted now that Nicola Sturgeon was the absolute flag flyer for this movement. I don't know if that's really true. You know, Labour, the Conservative, everybody was sort of following along the same rough policy path for many years before, until, you know, fairly recent times. It was just something that, in general, most politicians thought was a good thing that was potentially going to help out a minority group by giving them some new rights and protections. People just couldn't really quite intellectually got their head around the fact that this wasn't the same as rights for gay people and other things like that, but where these new rights were going to impinge on other rights. And, you know, I think it was just one of these things that it took society quite a while to work out all the issues.
Just one thing, Ben. I know you were talking about reform there and gender reform. Just looking at a headline from 4 months ago. Nigel Farage suggests MPs should debate rolling back abortion limit. Always good to hear from a champion of women's rights, Nigel Farage.
You've obviously got a laptop in front of you. I feel like I'm at a disadvantage.
If you were to actually ask reform,
I'm just saying that in December 2022, the only people arguing against the GRR bill were viewed as the far right, and now the people, the whole country more or less agrees that actually, yeah, that was a crazy idea.
Well, I think it was driven by feminist campaigners, but I balk at this idea that maybe folk in reform are really committed to women's rights. I think if you were to ask them their view on, you know, buffer zones, abortion, should 2 women be able to get married, I think that they would definitely be in the far right camp.
You're definitely sort of transposing a lot of what you think reform's views are about things.
I'm just reading out what the reform leader said about abortion.
What was that in the Guardian?
It was,
yeah. I thought it might be. Okay.
But I mean, they're just reporting what he said. He said it was worthy of discussion.
Is it not worthy of discussion? I think people, you know, all things are worthy of discussion.
Well, I mean, okay, worthy of discussion, is it? I guess you could argue that.
I mean, honestly, roll back to this same summit today could have taken place, and it would have been, oh, J.K. Rowling doesn't know what she's. It just shows that the wheel turns, and sometimes the people who are having all the mud thrown at them turn out to be the ones who were right all along.
Oh, yeah, it's been a complete disaster for the Scottish Government, and another example of Holyrood legislating in an area that maybe not out with their powers, but the law has been shot down by the
Yeah.
courts. And you had that with named person, GRR, hit the buffers as well, and now this other piece of legislation about gender representation on public boards. So it would be nice if MSPs could get back to the day job of actually legislating in a way that improved people's lives rather than constantly testing the boundaries of devolution.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more.
Good. Well, that was a lively one. Thanks very much to John and to Ben for joining me again. You can listen to this episode of Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Music, or watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single story.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.